So one of the very first people that I met as an intern at a hospital doing chaplaincy was this little woman named Judy. And Judy was a very short woman, and so I felt like I really towered over her when I was in her presence. But her faith really towered over mine. She had a husband who had undergone a lot of disease and problems in the last 5 years of their marriage or his life. And when I met her, I walked into this ICU room, and I realized that I was not stepping into an ICU room in the middle of a hospital, but I was really stepping into a home. She had paintings hung on the walls, and she had gifts from the grandchildren and her children, put on places. She even brought her own little table in and had trinkets on this table. And it was clear that her and her husband had been in that space for a very long time. In fact, actually, her husband had been there for 6 months when I met them. Judy had a friend who lived, he ate and breathed, 9-10-hour days in this small ICU room with her husband. Nobody talked about the fact that when you looked out her husband's window, you saw the cemetery. The reality is he was most likely never going to leave this room again. But Judy's faith prevailed. Every day she prayed to God. Every day before coming in to see her husband, she stopped by her church and she prayed. When I went in to visit her, she asked me every day to pray for a miracle. And after the first time she asked me to pray for a miracle, I went back to the other chaplains, as I was an intern, and I said, she wants me to pray for a miracle, and I don't think I can do that, because I don't see a miracle happen here. He's never going to leave this hospital. And one of the other chaplains pressed me on this. And, by day 3, I'm praying for a miracle with Judy. And we're praying for this miracle that I hope and believe is I hope happens, but believe is not going to happen. And Judy here is praying so hard for this miracle of recovery. And every conversation I have with her, she has such faith that God will provide, but more so, such faith that her husband is going to come out. She didn't have a doubt. And so as the weeks went on, I kept praying on my own time for Judy, for what would happen when her husband really does die and God lets her down. Because that's what I feared was going to happen, that God was going to let this very faithful woman down when her husband didn't make it. I got to be with Judy for 6 weeks before her husband died. And I had the privilege of actually being in the room with her and her husband and her children when he died. And I thought to myself in that moment, and as I prayed upon him and his body, that Judy have strength in this. I left that room, I hugged Judy, and I thought, I hope that her faith can sustain this. And it did. I didn't hear from Judy for several months, and I worried every day, and I prayed every day that she was making it through this, what I thought to be a terrible letdown of God. But she came back to the hospital, her cheery, faithful self one day, with a big basket full of food for the whole ICU unit. And she gave me a hug, and she told me about all the things, all the people she's reconnecting with, and all the things that she was doing. And I said, but are you okay? And she said, I didn't know if I was going to be okay when I lost him. I knew that he probably wasn't going to come out of this. But as much of those prayers for his miracle, for the miracle of him coming back and being cured, was also the miracle that I continue my faith. And that's what happened. God didn't let her continues. As a faithful man, as a faithful servant of God, he lives now in the kingdom of heaven, and she lives now free of the ICU room, a life that she had forgotten about. Whenever I read Ruth, I now think of Judy. Naomi lost everything. She was a faithful woman. And here she stood in a foreign country with daughter-in-laws who were foreign, not following her own faith. And she lost everything, her husband and her sons. In this time period, it was not okay to just be a woman without. And so this left Naomi without. She could have and would have become a beggar. Even going back home, she potentially leaves the risk to going home to be a beggar. And yet, she doesn't let her faith get ruined by this. She doesn't think to herself, my God has let me down. Instead, in her faith and in her strength, she believes that God will provide. And in doing so, God does. We're going to follow Ruth for the next couple of weeks and see how God provides for Ruth. But it is really easy, especially in our modern society with things that come at us when we want them to just say to ourselves, well, God let us down. I prayed for this and God didn't provide this, right? I prayed for and it didn't happen, so God must have not heard me. But that, my friends, limits God to our potential, to what we think God is. It limits God to what we think our life should be, and it doesn't allow for the vastness and the amazingness of God to work in our lives. It doesn't allow us to live faithfully in this world, knowing and being reassured time and time again that God is with us in all of our moments of struggle. This pandemic hasn't been easy. And this pandemic has tried a lot of us. There have been moments where I'm sure we have prayed so hard for something. And in grief, we stood back in loss. But in these moments, our relationship with God is defined. It is these moments in which we hold tight to that relationship with God instead of fleeing. It is in these moments that we give all that we have to God, knowing and trusting that God will provide. Our second scripture reading is from Luke, and it speaks to just this. It speaks of the poor woman who gave over only a tiny bit of money, but all that she had to the temple. And how her little donation, her little bit, was more powerful. She put her faith and trust in God. We must put our faith in, for only God can fill in these gaps. And so, my friends, today, I remind you that in the midst of all that is happening, when God seemingly lets you down, our Bible, faithful in the most trying of times, and they are rewarded. We too are rewarded when we stay faithful, even in the midst of when it doesn't look like the outcome is going to be in our favor. staying faithful to God, even when it feels like God has let us down, allows us to realize and to see that God is bigger than our limitations, and the potential with faith is outstanding. And so let the faithful of those stories in our Bible of the people who stuck with God, let the faithful in your life, those who had the same stories as Judy, who brought you into church and brought you into the pews, let the faithful and the faithfulness of yourself and your family lead you. And let us all stand up in our faith today. Amen. Our next